This will be a series of lectures on the subject of architectural wit, specifically architectural wit of the famous 20th century French-Swiss architect Le Corbusier. So, what is architectural wit? Well, an astute critic like Colin Rowe might point to the 1927 Villa Stein by Le Corbusier at Garches and analyze its front facade. Rowe hints at the symmetrical juxtaposition of the lowly service door with the main entry door represents a witty subversion of expectation, and of course classicism. Classicism requires a central axis. Le Corbusier not only denies that center, but creates an even more complex and intriguing, even cheeky juxtaposition between these two highly unequal doors. This is clearly an example of an intellectual, formal wit that contributes to the building's profoundness. But this is not a lecture series on this type of profound, formal wit in Le Corbusier's architecture. In this case, of complex and sophisticated symmetries. Instead, I will be pointing to far more personal and literal forms of wit, and I will argue that these are sometimes hidden front and center of his most important works of architecture. It is a vast trove, and I will argue largely unexamined. Very occasionally, these witty and personal meanings are intuited, but more times than not, they are simply bypassed or misinterpreted. I would suggest because they do not fit the mold of what Le Corbusier's architecture is supposed to mean. Perhaps the most famous and simultaneously infamous example of literal wit in Le Corbusier's architecture is in his famous Unité de Habitation at Marseille of 1957. Of all the things one can say about this important and wondrous project, the most enigmatic and hard to articulate for just about everyone is the metaphor of the housing complex as an ocean liner. Or it should be hard. Le Corbusier's poetic analogy goes something like this. Traditional French cities are dirty, unhealthy, congested, and we can look to contemporary engineering solutions such as the ocean liner for a new model of self-sufficient and healthy housing. Thus, he utilizes visual metaphors of the upright slab and raising of it up off the ground with pilotis to vaguely resemble a ship. He introduces a roof deck as a social condenser, just like a ship. A high parapet there frames views of the mountains and Mediterranean to emulate a complete immersion in nature. Finally, the accommodation of shopping, daycare, and post office further cement the metaphor of a self-sufficient ocean liner. This likely all sounds pretty familiar, and it's compelling stuff. But perhaps many of us at least intuitively know that Le Corbusier goes one step further with the visual analogy. In addition to these more suggestive and abstract functional allusions to the ocean liner, there are additional, literal, visual allusions. There are what appear to be smokestacks on the roof. The gymnasium roof is wittily shaped like an upturned lifeboat, complete with keel pointing to the sky. And the rear fire escape can be seen as a curly anchor rope. These were specific design decisions that weren't strictly necessary to contribute to the profound metaphor we just described. They go one step further. In fact, perhaps they can also be described as being kitschy. Now, the word kitsch is a complex and nuanced word, but for our purposes, it is Martin Filler's definition of architectural kitsch in his essay The Birdman that is most helpful in defining it in architecture. He states that just because a useful object or work of architecture is representational does not make it kitsch. A good example being some of Frank Gehry's architecture. Quote, "It occurs when architecture goes too far in helping the public make connections between forms and those possible representational meanings." End quote. The more literal detailing of the Unité as an ocean liner is thus a textbook example of kitsch, according to Filler. It is Charles Jenks alone who embraces elements of kitsch in Le Corbusier's oeuvre and frames the seeming intentional presence of it as presaging future art movements, and of course postmodernism. Critics tend to run as fast as they can away from elements of kitsch at the Unité and elsewhere in his oeuvre. After all, how can a widely acknowledged masterwork of architecture have elements of kitsch? One deeply perceptive critic refers to the tendency of critics to ignore such moments in Le Corbusier's architecture by dismissing them as though they were merely, quote, aberrations in an otherwise orderly mind, end quote. Kenneth Frampton absolutely avoids the entire metaphor and has merely one sentence in his chapter on the Unité stating that the housing project, quote, alludes to a boat on the Mediterranean, end quote. William Curtis also avoids the metaphor of the boat altogether in his monograph and only uses the term kitsch very briefly and passively in an analysis of the Open Hand Monument. Instead, there tends to be a focus on the more profound meanings of an ocean liner without getting one's hands dirty with the dark side of kitsch. Now time out! I know what you're thinking. I'm fully aware that Le Corbusier may not have specifically intended the gem to be a lifeboat, or the fire escape to be an anchor rope. There's simply no proof. Now everyone acknowledges the smokestacks. I beg you not to look at any one or two or handful of examples of what may be literal wit in his architecture and dismiss them as my vivid imagination. But instead, look at the dozens, literally dozens of similar examples I'll show in these lectures, front and center, of his most important architecture. Alternately, clearly, it is well established that wit, as I'm calling this phenomenon, is a well-established ingredient of his architecture that coexists with other languages and forms as part of the complex mélange that makes it so compelling. I'll get to that in a second, bear with me. Back to the Unité. I suggest we can compose a Venn diagram of meanings at the Unité in other of these compositions. Arguably, there are both abstract and literal meanings, universal meanings and highly personal ones, serious and humorous, profound and puerile. I will even go so far as to suggest that Le Corbusier saw this format as a way to discuss notions of good and evil. Another way I will describe this construct is as high and low meanings. High as in traditionally profound and resonant meanings, low as in humorous, personal, and sometimes perhaps even witty meanings. And perhaps most important of all, multivalent meanings and singular meanings. The field of Le Corbusian studies is stock full of eloquent warnings against trying to categorize meaning in his architecture. But I will suggest here that though this is very much a truism for his high meanings, it does not generally hold true for these witty, low meanings. In fact, I hope to show that Le Corbusier sometimes seems to go as far as he can to heighten the gap between these two meanings, time and again. Later in these lectures, I will remark on how other scholars have analyzed Le Corbusier's formative notion of the spirit-matter dialect from his early readings, and how this surely informed this concept. But just as a teaser, I suggest we can look at how Le Corbusier perhaps conceived of this opposition by way of Apollo and Medusa. Perhaps it is precisely this duality of meanings that he felt any successful work of art must have, such as good and evil. How can a work of architecture convey notions of evil? We shall see. Baby steps. The closest most analysts get to explaining this abrupt juxtaposition in meanings within the same piece of architecture is via the term montage, bricolage, or synthesis. That is, his architecture sometimes seems to be a collective of highly disparate parts. William Curtis says, for example, that his architecture is not just a montage of beguiling fragments. Quote, "The influences have all been transformed into a new compound of form and meaning, from which it is impossible to subtract an element without destroying the whole." End quote. But I believe this misses the point Le Corbusier sometimes intended. I hope to show that he intended these compositions and elements to be as different as possible from the main, profound meanings of their respective works of architecture. I'll return to offer an in-depth analysis of the Unité in its own full lecture and analysis. Though it is one of the more obvious examples of wit, it is also one of the harder to fully decipher. Let's look instead at his famous chapel of Notre de Ronchamp, inaugurated in 1955. There are ponderous and world-bending curved forms here. They're highly abstract and impenetrable. Arguably highly profound, and to some extent it reinvented architectural history. But these abstract shapes are put in immediate juxtaposition with circles and squares. They are not only of a wholly separate DNA, but they are near diametrical worlds apart in terms of what they represent and mean. I suggest these two separate languages fit into the categories I laid out earlier in the Venn diagram. Now, there is a third separate language at Ronchamp, and this is important, that of his own painting that Le Corbusier applied throughout the chapel. Let us look at the main entry door that he composed. Symbolism aside, it is very simply stated representational. A star is a star, a snake is a snake, and hands are, well, hands. Again, this is in utterly stark contrast to the almost cataclysmic abstractions of the form of the chapel body itself. Now, one may see the sails of a boat, mountain peaks, or even a nun's habit in the forms, but they were decidedly not intentionally composed by Le Corbusier to be those things. This is called visual pareidolia, and I will return to this exceptionally important concept later in the introduction. Stanislas von Moos stated it well, quote, "The inclusion of painting in Le Corbusier's architecture did not necessarily lead to an artistic whole. Painting and sculpture remained accessories to architecture, and no unification of the respective formal languages was attempted, as was the case, say, with the style movement or the Russian constructivists. Painting and architecture remain autonomous fields, each with its own grammar of forms." End quote. Christopher Green writes that even as Le Corbusier, quote, campaigned for a synthesis of the forms of art and architecture, he insisted on the separateness of the practices of art and architectural design. End quote. Christopher Pearson also writes of an increasing separatist program, with art being a guest in his early buildings, and that increased into a palpable antagonism later on. He gives special emphasis on Le Corbusier's unwillingness to collaborate with other artists. I will set aside this exceptionally important subject of Le Corbusier's painting for the moment. Despite Le Corbusier's enthusiastic demands for us to see his painting as the ultimate source for his architecture, it nevertheless remains separable from his architecture in the field. I will cover the language and potential meanings of his painting, at least insofar as it pertains to the Taurus or Bull series of paintings, in a separate lecture. But back to Ronchamp. Charles Jenks says in reference to Ronchamp, as prescient as always, quote, "If Le Corbusier had intended the architecture at Ronchamp to be carefully coded, then we can be sure that somewhere its very didactic creator would have left explicit comments and a reader's guide, as he did with other such works." End quote. At this point, let us shift to just a few years later, when Le Corbusier designs a gravesite for himself and his wife Yvonne on her death in 1957. I suggest it may have been composed by Le Corbusier as just such a Rosetta Stone for deciphering parts of Ronchamp. The gravesite overlooks the Mediterranean and is a steep climb up from their beloved vacation spot there on the coast. It consists of two geometric forms, a cylinder and a triangle, sitting on a low plinth. A colored enamel plaque contains names and dates and depicts an abstracted but similar view of the Mediterranean's horizon which we face. Deborah Gans writes in her The Le Corbusier Guide, quote, He intended the cylinder, a known geometric symbol for the feminine in his lexicon of architectural forms, to represent Yvonne, and the angular solid in turn to represent himself. End quote. She goes on to point out that a seashell adjacent to his marker and a cross adjacent to hers, quote, represent their respective faiths, worship of nature for him and Christianity for her, end quote. I would argue the two geometric shapes on the grave appear to represent a surprisingly direct, coded language of sorts, in this case with autobiographical references. Collective wisdom, on the other hand, suggests we must first assign a far more broad and profound meaning to the grave. And the horizon sunset motif is well known to have just such general meanings. William Curtis, for example, more properly states, the tomb represents, quote, themes of a lifetime, end quote. Others collectively say something like, they express Le Corbusier's love of the core geometric forms as the building blocks of his architecture. And in all fairness to Deborah Gans, lest she be accused of enabling me, first writes, quote, the grave represents the most consistent and compelling aspects of his cosmos, prismatic solids, natural objects, and the ever-elusive horizon line, end quote. Of course, both sets of meanings are true. The more profound, abstract, and expansive meaning is true, but so is the more didactic, dry, and even banal one. Yes, others have pointed to the apparent and fairly subtle references to the feminine and masculine in these particular geometric shapes in his architecture, as stated earlier, but not particularly rigorously so. I suggest this is a rare example of a scholar, Deborah Gans, looking at architecture and using common sense visual formal analysis to connect forms to the historical record. Is it so unpalatable that Le Corbusier may have intended the primary meaning of his own grave to be something pithy and stark, like, here lies Le Corbusier, whose religion was nature, and his wife, Yvonne, who was a Christian, and not the more anodyne, geometric forms were the bedrock of my architecture. The honest truth is, the grave design is not particularly beloved. There's not much analysis other than the general type that I mentioned. Like the cylinder and pyramid at Ronchamp, I suspect the reason for this is that many are simply a bit fluxant. It so happens he spoke to precisely this at age 24 on his famous journey to the East. He wrote, quote, the obsession for symbols that lies deep inside me is like a yearning for a language limited to only a few words. I would prefer geometric combinations, the square, the circle, end quote. Elsewhere, he writes of, quote, a visual game in which the author has created the rules, a simple scheme of recognized signs, end quote. If Le Corbusier intended to represent himself and his wife with triangle and cylinder at his grave, wouldn't it seem reasonable to ask whether a similar composition at Ronchamp just 2 years earlier might have similar autobiographical meanings? I will explore the possibility and several other radical ideas in my individual lecture on Ronchamp. Now, the few examples of what might be a coded language in Le Corbusier's architecture, the overly literal boat metaphor at the Unité, and the presence of cylinders, triangles, and squares, doesn't yet seem to fit into all the descriptors in my Venn diagram. Where's the deeply personal? Where's the good and evil? The Unité is certainly witty, but not any of the other items. The use of a cylinder and triangle at the grave may have been intended as a coded language of sorts, but largely it is just a bit puzzling, and perhaps a bit unsatisfyingly perfunctory. Baby steps. To be clear, I've used the term wit in this title only because it is the clearest entree into the subject, without utterly baffling any and all who are willing to engage. Instead, the real theme of these coded meanings throughout his architecture would more properly and accurately be labeled Le Corbusier's architectural wit, revenge, self-memorialization, and confessionals. Keep in mind, Le Corbusier had decades to develop and explore this hidden world, and we are only just now beginning to glimpse it. Before we dive into examples of how Le Corbusier may have attempted such expressions, let us first look to well-known examples of precisely the same phenomenon in the art world as composed by Michelangelo, the great painter, sculptor, and architect. In this case, in his role as a painter. When he was commissioned to fresco the Last Judgment on the entire west wall of the Sistine Chapel, he naturally fulfilled his patron's wishes by depicting Jesus Christ on Judgment Day deciding the fate of the masses. With hand gestures, Jesus commands the faithful and observant on his right to be pulled up to heaven, and the sinful and evil to be dragged downward, to his left to hell. But within this elaborate and swirling, high, traditional composition, Michelangelo baldly and even fragrantly composed at least two highly personal stories or low narratives. They are related to the larger theme of Judgment Day fresco, but they also reflect highly specific and personal instances of external struggles and inner combat, again, as Le Corbusier would euphemistically say. It is as though for Michelangelo, the recording of these personal experiences must be done at all costs for perpetuity. The first inserted and semi-concealed low narrative is a rather prominent depiction of St. Matthew holding the flayed skin of the martyr St. Bartholomew. The limp skin seems to represent Michelangelo's own face. St. Matthew is perhaps looking back to Jesus for his decision on Michelangelo's fate. Here, in a seemingly devout statement, it can perhaps be interpreted that he is recording his own inner combat about whether he is a good or bad person regarding his own impending death. Will Michelangelo, perched precariously to the left and damned side of Jesus, go to heaven or hell? Surely humility and self-deprecation by the artist is in order under the circumstances. It is perhaps a confession of pious anxiety of sorts. The second low insertion by Michelangelo in The Last Judgment is the likeness of another actual topical historic figure, Cardinal Biagio da Cesena, who had deigned to criticize Michelangelo's nudes in the very same fresco as appropriate only for public baths and taverns. Michelangelo depicts Cardinal Cesena as Minos, a judge of the underworld, complete with donkey ears, in the far lower right corner of the composition. Sardonically, a serpent in turn perhaps judges Cesena by biting him squarely on the genitals, and simultaneously covers his modesty. Was Michelangelo getting revenge, or as Le Corbusier more floridly stated it, recording his struggles? The point here is not that we know exactly what Michelangelo was thinking when he painted these personal insertions, nor even what the precise narrative he intended to convey with either of these compositions. It is not to say that Le Corbusier was inspired by Michelangelo or even the fraternal Western tradition of artists including their own self-portraits in their artworks. Rather, perhaps it is an illustration of the universality of the inherent motivation artists might feel to imbue a work of art they are so heavily invested in with pieces of themselves. Literal self-expression, if you will. Even the earliest examples of prehistoric humans reproducing their own hand on cave walls and spontaneously reinvented around the world can be interpreted at one level, despite a whole host of other meanings, as an almost primal expression of, I was here. And it is not that artists uniquely have these feelings about self-preservation and intimate self-expression, but like Le Corbusier and Michelangelo, they do have an exceptionally unique and constant opportunity in front of them to do so. And they are specifically trained to communicate complex ideas visually. It was perhaps Le Corbusier's peculiar and unique insight to explore whether his architecture could be the vehicle of such literal self-expression. It can generally be said that there are at least two main meanings to any work of art, such as The Last Judgment, or architecture as in Le Corbusier's case. What an artist says the work means can of course be central to interpreting a work of art's meaning. There is, on the other hand, meanings that outsiders, historians, and time project onto the work. Sometimes these two sets of meanings are quite similar, sometimes not. Neither is definitive. History and ultimately meaning, after all, are non-existent. It is wholly a man-made interpretive construct. But sometimes there is a third category, and that is the heart of this lecture series. Meanings an artist imbues a work with that are reserved for themselves, or for some mysterious audience or posterity. And these meanings can be hidden or apparent. Clearly, Michelangelo's compositions, just discussed, fall under this third category. When these third category meanings are apparent, they're generally simply mentioned in passing. This is understandable because humor and wit is not generally considered to have the same inherent capacities for deeper meanings as drama and more serious artistic compositions. They are more oddities. It is worth stating that Michelangelo is thought to have included at least one other self-portrait in one of his sculptures, the Florentine Pietà or Deposition. And there he depicts himself in the place of the biblical character Nicodemus, the everyman who piously helps remove Jesus from the cross. The sculpture may have originally been intended for Michelangelo's own tomb. But unlike painting or sculpture, it would not seem possible for architecture, the third discipline that Michelangelo mastered, and as the Renaissance man that he was, to be an appropriate medium for figurative and literal autobiographical reflection and narrative. And yet, tantalizingly, there is evidence that he at least considered including physiognomic figurations in his architecture. One study of a column molding shows his attempt to incorporate a man's face in profile, perhaps only with offhanded, humorous intent. There is no evidence that Michelangelo sought to include any self-referential imagery in his architecture. But this odd bit of historical evidence does seem to suggest the extreme laterality of thinking that both Michelangelo and Le Corbusier seem to have shared. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road in terms of the stakes of these lectures. I am going to suggest that one of the major categories of witty insertions by Le Corbusier that he inserted in his architecture is almost identical to what Michelangelo did in his fresco. Specifically, Le Corbusier was wont to compose faces and phalluses. Let me say that again. There is a substantial amount of evidence that Le Corbusier purposely composed faces and phalluses front and center of his architecture. In fact, I'll even make the argument that some of the faces can even be seen to be self-portraits. And the frequent subject or narratives of these compositions, again, just like Michelangelo, seem to be wit, revenge, self-memorialization, and confessions. There are so many questions. Why would Le Corbusier do such a thing? What were the meanings of such compositions? And how can we analyze the actual historical chronology of each project's design through drawings for further insight into his possible intentions? What is the relationship, if any, to the primary historical meanings historians have given the buildings? As I have said, there is an excellent analysis of the higher and more profound meanings of Le Corbusier's architecture to be found, often with great concurrence. But before we get into these larger questions about the phenomenon, we have a long slog ahead of us in terms of merely reviewing each of the individual potential compositions and reviewing the associated evidence in each case. As I mentioned, they are voluminous. Again, while any one of these fairly intricate and highly specific compositions could surely be seen as my vivid imagination, I ask your patience in reviewing all the evidence cumulatively before making judgment. I'm not the first person to suggest that Le Corbusier seems to have designed faces and phalluses into his architecture. Charles Jinks, for example, writes that the far younger Charles Jeanneret, his name before Le Corbusier, seems to have designed a series of faces into his early villas in La Chaux-de-Fonds. Jinks says that, quote, as with all the symmetrical facades of his buildings, the face motif at the Villa Stotzer, windows his eyes, door his mouth, is veiled, end quote. He includes his own photo, Jinks includes his own photo of the north entrance door at the Villa Stotzer. Jinks also includes a study watercoloring by Jeanneret of the main facade of the same Villa Stotzer, saying that, quote, deep gable hoods give the building the presence, even the character, of a face, end quote. A quick glance of the main elevation of the Villa Fallet shows what might even be an even more elaborate upside-down face. In later years, Le Corbusier actually requests us to turn compositions upside down to view them. Daniel Nageli actually writes a whole series of essays on this apparent phenomenon of Le Corbusier composing faces into his architecture. First, in his Un corps à habiter, the image of the body in the oeuvre of Le Corbusier, Nageli speaks to the apparent presence of both physiognomic and anthropomorphic presences in his architecture. And he makes this specific proposition that Le Corbusier may have consciously designed the chapel of Notre Dame de Ronchamps east facade as a face. Without question, Daniel Nageli was the first scholar to find this particular face at Ronchamp. But frustratingly, he doesn't go far enough and recognize the inherent wit of the composition, here and elsewhere. Instead, he assumes that it is a masterful composition of ambiguity in fitting with the tendency towards high meanings that most scholars associate with Le Corbusier's best works of architecture. I will take up where Nageli left off and try to more properly categorize this and other compositions at Ronchamp in my lecture there. And I'll introduce the term anamorphosis later in this introduction. It is key to understanding Ronchamp and the compositions there. Nageli's later essay, Finding Faces, is also an excellent historical overview of the surrealist and Pablo Picasso's fascination with concealed physiognomy, and how that milieu clearly informed both Le Corbusier's painting and his architecture. I will focus primarily on Salvador Dali's deep influence. Finally, in his 2006 biography on Le Corbusier, Nicholas Fox Weber mentions the propensity for Le Corbusier to compose faces in his architecture. I certainly may be missing other scholars' suggestions of apparent physiognomy in Le Corbusier's architecture, and if you know of any, please let me know in the comments. Ah yes, I did mention phalluses. It is actually Colin Rowe in his famous Mathematics of the Ideal Villa who points out Le Corbusier's apparent, witty, planimetric reference to Claude Nicolas Ledoux' infamous House of Pleasure, a brothel in the shape of an erect phallus. It's on the rooftop of the Villa Stein. Rowe cryptically writes, quote, and there is also present with him a purely French delight in the more overt aspects of mechanics. The little pavilion on the roof at Garches is at the same time a temple of love and the bridge of a ship, end quote. Cryptic, but well, it was 1947. I'll come back to this in my specific lecture on the Villa Savoye, where, spoiler alert, Le Corbusier seems to have taken the Ledoux quotation to a whole other level. The next important background to establish here in my introduction are my own personal, professional life experiences that have, for better or worse, given me this unique capacity to see these peculiar phenomena in Le Corbusier's architecture. I may be one of the more unlikely historians of Le Corbusier, and certainly an accidental tourist to the matter. I am first and foremost a practicing architect, and I'd like to think my own architecture tends towards the meditative, decidedly not wit. An important formative experience for me was from about 1990 to 2000, when I was involved with the Boston office of the architect Jorge Silvetti. Additionally, he was my thesis advisor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. The experience in the office is so seminal to this topic of figurations in Le Corbusier's architecture that I will devote another entire lecture to the subject. But for those not particularly familiar with his work, it is fair to simply say that the aspect most foreign and an anathema for me at the time was the general willingness to actively engage in wit. And specifically, his architecture frequently made use of physiognomy and what appears to be the occasional phallus. Woe be it for any historical figure to be recounted by a disciple, but the experience is indispensable to this story. As well, my first-hand experiences translating witty compositions from a principle and the elliptical conversations required have perhaps given me additional insights into how Le Corbusier's bizarre ideas could very well have made their way into built form via the convoluted infrastructure of an office, and most likely utterly without the staff's knowledge. Now, we are all likely generally aware of the postmodern movement and its propensity towards wit and the occasional use of physiognomic compositions on facades, faces on facades. In school, this may have been referred to me as a, quote, return to humanism, which never satisfied me as an explanation. I will devote an entire lecture on my own take on the apparent history of physiognomic and other anthropomorphic projections in architecture in the West, at least from the Renaissance till today. Spoiler alert, I'm starting with the famous entry door to the Palazzo Zuccari in Rome and the Orcus Mouth Pavilion in the Bomarzo Gardens outside Rome as being absolutely seminal. Again, the history of physiognomy in architecture has simply not been codified. In a way, it exists outside the formal history of architecture. Surprisingly, there has been a nearly unbroken string of architects playing with physiognomy, at least since the Renaissance up until today. And one of the most surprising time periods of this apparent resurgence appears to be in the early 20th century, including such modernists as Adolf Loos and Gunnar Asplund. I wrote an entire analysis of Adolf Loos' supposedly mute residential facades proposing physiognomic wit. Perhaps this early 20th century resurgence has to do with the introduction of photography into architectural publications and the attendant feedback loop, and perhaps the ever-present urge for the younger generation to poke fun at their elder gatekeepers. The young and cheeky Charles Jeanneret didn't invent the phenomenon. The next deeply influential factor for me was the presence of the Harvard Lampoon building of 1909 on the Harvard campus. Any architect visiting the campus is sure to encounter this deeply peculiar building. It was designed by Edmund Wheelwright, a Boston architect who also happened to be on the Harvard Lampoon Journal staff while he was a student. It seems to feature a rather distinctive and humorous face on the end facade, complete with a hat and mustache. Deciphering potential meanings of this building is so interesting and complex that again I'll devote another whole lecture examining it. I remember sitting in front of the building decades ago now and pondering whether it was truly possible that an architect would have actually composed a face on a building. It was just, well, so utterly preposterous. My views and familiarity with the topic have come quite a ways since then, but perhaps many of you who may be new to the phenomenon may have a similar learning curve. Marge Bacon writes in her book, Le Corbusier in America, about his having 3 distinct personalities, each captured by a series of photographs of him on a plane. I've taken her insightful analysis and reduced it to 2 personalities. Here's the seminal event she points to, where he puts a plastic fork and knife in his glasses on an airplane during his trip to America in 1935. But there are plenty of other examples of him clowning around. On the same trip, the morning after securing a prostitute for the night in Chicago, he playfully puts the silver service lid on his head. He posed with his cousin, Pierre, and Amédée Ozenfant on a sofa with one of his vases on his head. In posing with his family far earlier, he puts something like a dunce cap on his head. Apparently it's a recurring motif. In one group photo, he puts on welder's goggles. Le Corbusier visits the Escorial during his 1928 Spain trip and was escorted by locals, where he clambers up onto an extremely high and precarious stone sphere. I suggest this was a rather charged moment for everyone involved. I see this as an irrepressible urge to be subversive at times, and I'll recount a few additional very telling historical events that are critical to this understanding. Robin Evans speaks of Le Corbusier's willingness to risk being the clown in his analysis of Ronchamp, and his intuitive reading of the building as being deeply subversive. Le Corbusier even sometimes referred to himself as a clown, or an acrobat, amongst many other things. Jane Drew, his faithful associate in India, is quoted saying in reference to Le Corbusier, quote, "I have an idea, and that is that all of the really great men I've known have all had the element of the clown in them." End quote. These hidden new meanings are not intended to replace the older, traditional ones. Le Corbusier was obviously not only a clown, only in rare instances. It will be fairly easy to lose sight of this during this journey, but it's absolutely critical to come to see that it is both meanings, sometimes presented immediately adjacent to one another, that coexist. To see these two meanings simultaneously exist and creative personality traits associated is like coming to understand the conundrum in school we learned that electrons are both a particle and a wave, or later in life that somehow tomatoes are both a fruit and a vegetable. There is another dualist construct at work here. I would prefer to avoid the tired stereotypes of the French, poetic, creative hemisphere of Le Corbusier as compared to his Swiss and Germanic one, more rigorous and ordered. But it is remarkably helpful in terms of understanding how Le Corbusier's architecture can be both multivalent on one hand and categorical and singular on the other. Perhaps even he bought into it to some extent in his quest to become a Mediterranean man. Nicholas Fox Weber's biography on Le Corbusier came out in 2006, and it's correct to say that it is the first comprehensive biography on the artist. It is an excellent and thorough accounting of just who this mysterious creative figure actually was in real life. It largely breaks through the complex and intricate facade built up over all these years of near godliness and impenetrability. Newsflash, Le Corbusier was human. Despite the great success of the work as a biographical accounting, it is perhaps fair to say it was met with indifference in some quarters. One criticism I saw was that it didn't present anything that wasn't already known to the field. But what I think is really meant by that comment is, we didn't really need to put his whole life out there. The biography presents many of his warts, and is not always a pleasant read. But I believe a fuller embrace and accounting of his complex personal life is fundamental to the next frontier of Le Corbusian historical analysis. Related to this, Ivan Zachnik crafted a rather thoughtful analysis and translation of Le Corbusier's last publication, Mise en Point, published just after his death, and it's highly autobiographical. Zachnik writes, "In some ways, it is a summing up of the myriad of his utopian plans and visions that were refused. Because its overall tone is generally one of bitterness and frustration, it must be remembered that it was written after the consecutive deaths of his wife and then mother, when many of his friends and colleagues claimed he was a changed man. It is not generally considered one of the more celebrated of his many publications. In fact, it is a bit painful and embarrassing to see so clearly into his raw psyche. It confuses and embarrasses." End quote. I would suggest it is writing like this, and by Le Corbusier himself, that perhaps many would prefer to avoid. In earlier times, perhaps it was justified to avoid speaking about the complicated and even troubled early sexuality of the younger Charles Jeanneret, his ongoing preoccupation with prostitutes, and later womanizing. It is, after all, none of our business, better left unsaid and perhaps sensationalizing. But most importantly, for historical purposes, these types of historical details might seem impossible influences on his architecture. I am suggesting a reconsideration of this assumption. For example, coming to a fuller understanding of his complicated sexuality is quite possibly key to being able to understand some of these compositions, precisely such as we shall see in the lecture on the Villa Savoye. His inclusion of a phallus at the villa can thus come to be seen not just as rather blunt examples of cheeky wit and nose-thumbing subversion, but as potentially something far more personally meaningful and poignant to his own sense of self. Again, perhaps as Zachnik says, it is a bit painful and embarrassing to see so clearly into his raw psyche. But because it has been made part of the physical work itself, it becomes by definition historically relevant. And perhaps this is exactly what Le Corbusier intended, whether we like it or not. There has always been the enigmatic presence of Yvonne Gallas, Le Corbusier's wife, hovering around the periphery of the history of Le Corbusier's best architecture. She is so curious because she seems to have always hated modern architecture, and especially the fact that she was forced to live in a light-filled apartment of his design for much of their time together. She couldn't stand pretentiousness, she was earthy, had an odd and racy sense of humor. Le Corbusier described her as pathologically wild. In contrast, the predominant image of Le Corbusier is as a monkish creator, man of letters, world traveler, and creator of the most moving and intellectually stimulating architecture. The two seem utterly incongruent, but I suggest in short that many of the qualities traditionally attached to her could very simply also be applied to him, or at least one side of him, and as expressed in his architecture. And I'll get into a deeper analysis of Yvonne in my lecture on Ronchamp, where it is particularly poignant. Another enigma ever present in the scholarship is Le Corbusier's deep love of François Rabelais, the author of the Gargantua and Pantagruel novels. One can bend over backwards in trying to elevate the narrative of Rabelais' presence in Le Corbusier's architecture. Yes, there are arguably some profound themes in the novels, but the cold truth is, scatological references, bawdy, earthy narratives, and ongoing deep subversion seem simply inexplicable on its face. But I suggest the capacity to see this impish, subversive, clownish side to Le Corbusier goes a long way in reconciling this paradox. Le Corbusier's identification with Don Quixote, with his constant uphill and self-delusional battles, are far easier to see. The immersion into these previously concealed narratives was a jolt and shock for me as I made my way through his catalog. Despite my joy of detecting and sleuthing, it was also deflating. It's not what I would have wanted to discover. Even mourning. To this end, I can completely understand the wholesale refutation of these potential narratives and embrace of traditional ones. I don't think one would be wrong to do so. However, in an age when we are prone to discover unsavory or undesired facts about creative figures who have been so instrumental in shaping us, there are becoming somewhat clearer ways we might reconcile great art from flawed creators. And though I would prefer not to conflate my own research with the facts of Le Corbusier's collaboration during the Vichy regime and Nazi occupation of France, and its fascist affiliations, perhaps they are fairly similar in terms of our need to reconcile artist and work. I will suggest that his ongoing womanizing and infidelities to his wife Yvonne must be fully embraced and fully understood as integral to translating some of his compositions, especially as it seems to touch on his general devotion and perhaps guilt towards her. I'll get into this complicated subject in more depth in the conclusion. Visual pareidolia is the scientific phenomenon of the human brain assigning meaning to random visual stimulus, where no meaning exists. Classic examples are seeing a face in the moon or figures in cloud formations. Le Corbusier exclaimed that on a trip to India he, quote, saw a face in the moon for the first time, end quote. At another point in India, he apparently sees a face in a rock, puts his glasses on it to complete it, and poses for his picture. He was often seeing figures in rock formations, just like Salvador Dali. I will argue that this was an almost seminal importance to Le Corbusier, perhaps because he saw it as a phenomenon of the primitive cultures he so admired, people who could elevate the everyday into the spiritual and mythological, something he saw as lost in modernity. Yes, the term primitive is a highly problematic one to use, but it is fairly indispensable in capturing the zeitgeist of those modernists who saw a spirituality and capacity for creating beauty and meaning lost in their contemporary society. It is a deeply flawed and narrow worldview, but historically accurate use of the term. Anamorphosis is the visual concoction common in the Renaissance of playing tricks with perspective by creating false foreshortenings. A good example in architecture being Borromini's composition at the Palazzo Spada, or Bernini's Scala Regia at the Vatican. The term anamorphosis is rarely associated with Le Corbusier. After all, he proselytized and romanticized over the promenade, the process of apprehending a building through moving through it. Anamorphosis is generally considered a static phenomenon. I'll analyze his apparent and extensive use of anamorphosis in my lecture on Ronchamp, but for now, there is one event that fairly beautifully captures his fascination with both of these phenomena. While in India and driving along, at one point he asks the car to stop so that he can get out and sketch a branch he sees at the side of the road. He noticed that this simple stick transformed into a rearing horse as they moved past. This is textbook pareidolia and anamorphosis. Now, what I'm suggesting in these lectures is the presence, essentially, of secret hidden meanings in Le Corbusier's architecture. And what admirer of Notre Dame de Ronchamp hasn't looked at awe on the building and just felt intuitively that something deeper is being represented there, under the surface? I know I have from very early on. Perhaps one of the first things some scholars might point to when hearing this is the presence of mystical themes in his architecture. The term mystical tends to be a catch-all term for several other themes such as the occult, spiritual, Greco-Minoan mythology, autobiography, and Yvonne, his wife, as a deity. And these are fairly well-studied topics. Traditionally, it is his cryptic and well-known poem of the right angle that pushes these meanings to the extreme, and has sometimes been used as a Rosetta Stone for his architecture. Mogens Krustup, Richard Moore, Christopher Green, Daphne Beckett-Shary, and Robert Coombs are some scholars who have written extensively on the topic. Their scholarship begins first with an analysis of Le Corbusier's post-1928 paintings for their full range of presumably and likely intended mystical meanings. However, they sometimes go one step further and subsequently attempt, to varying levels of intensity, to project these meanings into his architecture. For example, one scholar states that perhaps moon goddesses, solar bulls, mercurial waters, hermaphrodites, cosmic eggs, and perceptive nipples all feature a bit more heavily than is warranted. And I'm afraid this is likely true, at least as far as the architecture goes. The intended meanings of his paintings are quite a bit different. Again, I believe it is critical to see the apparent seawall he seems to have kept in practice between his art and architecture. No matter how many words to us saying to the contrary, begging us to link the two. Again, I'll pick up the complex relationship between his painting and architecture in my lecture on the Taurus series of paintings, and I'll argue that it is at least one series of his paintings that appear to come very close to this alternate low language of meaning he used in his architecture. Likely because it apparently had such a profound personal meaning to him. These lectures were inspired in my preparing for another earlier series of lectures as an introduction to architecture course I presented within the Stanford Department of Continuing Studies. So a big thank you to Charles Junkerman for his support and all the students there over the years. I also lectured on this topic at Chandigarh University in India just as the COVID crisis was emerging. Their enthusiastic reception to this odd body of research gave me a new energy and optimism. The lectures to come are listed here. For now, I'm planning about 14 more. Most of them are on his major monuments and are presented chronologically. It was a really difficult choice not to group subjects thematically, but what are you going to do? Again, the analysis has pointed me to a variety of lateral historical subjects that I think can stand to be included in a format like this. For example, it seems quite relevant to begin compiling a larger history of the subject of personal wit in architecture, at least since the Renaissance. I've no doubt you all can help me add to this highly incomplete list. An analysis of a very specific strain of painting, the Taurus series, is especially revealing into these alternate modes of meaning. I'll look at some other historic artists who may have dabbled in some of these hidden, low, and personal themes in their paintings, such as Caravaggio and Joseph Wright of Derby. The list or order of these lectures may change as I create them, but for now, here they are, and they'll be listed in the comments.